Your Thoughts Are Building You or Burning You * is a 15-chapter field manual for anyone ready to stop treating their own mind as unpredictable weather and start treating it as the construction site it has always actually been. Every thought repeated becomes a belief. Every belief becomes a filter. Every filter becomes the life you end up living, and this book exists to hand you the tools to decide, deliberately, what gets built. Each chapter follows the same disciplined structure: a sharp opening idea, an honest exploration of the psychology working beneath the surface, a paradigm-shifting reframe, a set of concrete, standalone systems you can apply immediately, and a closing vision of the mind you are becoming. There is no filler here, and no hollow positivity. Every chapter is built to be read once for insight and returned to repeatedly as a working manual. This book will not tell you to simply think positive. It will show you, with precision, why your language, your filters, your inherited beliefs, and your under-pressure patterns have been quietly building you for years, and how to take deliberate authorship of that construction, one thought at a time. Chapter 1: The Architect and the Arsonist. Very thought you think today is either laying a brick or striking a match. There is no third option. There is no neutral thought that simply passes through you and leaves nothing behind. You are, at this exact moment, either constructing the person you claim you want to become, or you are quietly burning her down, and the terrifying, liberating truth is that you cannot always tell which one you're doing while you're doing it. The problem beneath the problem. We have been taught to think of thoughts as weather, something that happens to us, passes through us, and dissolves without consequence. A bad mood rolls in like a storm cloud. A wave of self-doubt washes over us. This language is not an accident. It is a defense mechanism, and it is catastrophically wrong. Weather does not accumulate inside a structure. Thoughts do. Consider a composite figure I'll call Nkechi, a talented graphic designer with genuine skill, built from a pattern observed across countless creative professionals. Nkechi did not have a dramatic breakdown. She had something far more common and far more dangerous: a quiet, near-constant internal narration that ran beneath her conscious awareness, cycling phrases like, "I'm probably not good enough for this client, they're going to realize I got lucky," and, "I'll never be as good as the designers I admire." None of these thoughts arrived as a single devastating blow. Each one, in isolation, felt almost too small to matter, a passing flicker, gone in a second, surely harmless. Over 6 years, Nkechi turned down 3 significant opportunities that would have expanded her career, each time citing practical reasons that sounded reasonable on the surface: bad timing, not the right fit, too risky. What she could not see, because it was operating below the threshold of conscious inspection, was that 6 years of repeated self-doubting thoughts had constructed something structural inside her, a load-bearing belief that she was fundamentally an imposter, temporarily undetected. This belief did not arrive as one thought. It was built, brick by brick, from thousands of small thoughts that each felt too insignificant to resist. This is the first truth this book must install in you immediately, because nothing else in these pages will make sense without it. Thoughts are not passing weather. They are construction material. Every thought you repeat becomes a belief. Every belief you hold becomes a filter through which you interpret new information. Every filter determines which opportunities you notice and which you dismiss, which risks you take and which you avoid, which version of yourself you rehearse into existence and which version quietly starves from neglect. And here is the second truth, the one that gives this chapter its title: this construction process cuts both ways with equal power. The same mechanism that built Nkechi's quiet self-erosion is precisely the mechanism available to build something else entirely: competence, resilience, unshakable self-trust. The mechanism itself is morally neutral. It does not care what you build with it. It will construct a fortress or a funeral pyre with identical efficiency, depending entirely on which materials you feed it, repeated over time. Consider the inverse case: a composite entrepreneur I'll call Damelaire, who faced business setbacks objectively more severe than Nkechi's discomfort: a failed product launch, a lost investor, a public and humiliating mistake in front of industry peers. But Damelaire had, over years, deliberately cultivated a different internal narration, not blind positivity, but a specific and repeated interpretive habit. This is data, not verdict, rehearsed after every setback until it became automatic. This single repeated thought, chosen and reinforced across hundreds of difficult moments, built something structurally different inside him, a belief that failure was informative rather than damning. 9 years later, Daimler had built 3 companies, 2 of which failed outright, and none of which damaged his underlying sense of capability, because that sense of capability had been constructed from a different set of repeated thoughts entirely. Same mechanism. Opposite structures. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a matter of one person being naturally more resilient than the other by some fixed temperament. It is a matter of which thoughts, repeated with enough frequency, were allowed to become architecture. The paradigm shift. Here is the reframe that must anchor every subsequent chapter of this book: you are not the passive recipient of your thoughts. You are, whether you have claimed the role or not, the architect responsible for what gets built from them. This is an uncomfortable promotion. It is far easier to believe that your self-doubt, your anxiety, your limiting belief simply happened to you, that you are innocent of their construction, a victim of circumstances beyond your control. That belief is comforting precisely because it removes responsibility. It is also the single greatest obstacle standing between you and the reconstruction this book will guide you through. This does not mean every difficult thought is your fault, and it does not mean you can simply choose, through sheer force of positive thinking, to never experience doubt, fear, or grief again. That version of this idea is a shallow distortion that collapses under the first real hardship it meets. What this reframe actually demands is more precise and more powerful. You may not control which thoughts arrive uninvited, but you have far more control than you currently exercise over which thoughts you rehearse, which ones you grant repeated residency, and which ones you evict before they can lay a single additional brick. This is the distinction between a thought and a belief. A thought is a single event, brief, often involuntary, frequently absurd if examined closely. A belief is a thought that has been granted repetition. The gap between these two categories is where your actual power lives, and almost nobody has been taught to locate it. You have been taught to manage your circumstances, your schedule, your diet, your finances. Almost nobody has taught you to manage your repetition, to notice, with the same seriousness you would apply to a budget or a business plan, which internal sentences you are allowing to run on a loop, and to what structure they are quietly contributing. Consider what this means practically. The thought, "I might fail at this," is not dangerous in itself. It is a reasonable, even useful, single flicker of risk assessment. It becomes dangerous only through repetition, through being replayed nightly, rehearsed before every attempt, allowed to become the default lens through which every new opportunity is filtered. The danger was never the thought's arrival. The danger is always, exclusively, its repetition without challenge. The systems. System 1, the architecture audit. Once weekly, identify the 2 or 3 thoughts that recur most frequently in your internal narration, not the thoughts you have deliberately chosen, but the ones that simply keep showing up uninvited during idle moments, before sleep, or during moments of stress. Write them down exactly as they occur, without softening them. This audit is not for judgment. It is for visibility, because a thought you cannot see clearly is a thought you cannot yet redirect. Most people have never once written down their most repeated internal sentence. This single act of visibility is frequently the first moment someone recognizes they have been building, unknowingly, for years. System 2, the brick or match test. Before allowing any recurring thought to run its automatic course, pause and ask explicitly, is this thought, repeated, laying a brick toward the person I am trying to become, or striking a match against her? This is not a test of whether the thought is pleasant. Some necessary, bricklaying thoughts are uncomfortable, such as honest recognition of a mistake that needs correcting. It is a test of construction versus destruction, applied deliberately rather than left to unconscious default. System 3, the interruption phrase. For any thought identified as a match rather than a brick, install a short, specific interruption phrase to be deployed the instant the thought begins its familiar loop, not a denial of the thought's existence, but a deliberate refusal to grant it further repetition. Something as simple and specific as noted. Not rehearsing this, spoken internally, consistently, breaks the automatic pathway that repetition would otherwise reinforce. The interruption does not need to be elaborate. It needs to be immediate and consistent, because the danger was never a single thought, it was always the uninterrupted loop. System 4, the deliberate replacement brick. An interrupted thought leaves a vacancy, and vacancies left unfilled are frequently reclaimed by the very thought you just interrupted. For each recurring match thought identified in your audit, prepare in advance one specific, honest, bricklaying replacement thought to install in its place, not a hollow affirmation disconnected from reality, but a precise, defensible statement your own evidence can support, such as replacing, "I always mess this up," with the more accurate and more useful, "I have struggled with this before and adjusted successfully at least twice." Precision matters here far more than positivity. A replacement thought that is vague or unbelievable will not survive contact with a difficult day. The closing declaration. There is a version of you, further down this road than today's page, who no longer experiences her own mind as unpredictable weather to be endured. She has become, instead, the deliberate architect of her own internal structure, not immune to doubt, not free of the occasional match struck by an old, familiar fear, but skilled now at recognizing construction material the instant it arrives, and disciplined enough to choose, consistently, which version of herself gets built from it. This is not a distant, mystical transformation reserved for people with rarer minds than yours. It is a skill, mechanical and learnable, built the same way every skill in this book will be built, through repetition, deliberately aimed. The thoughts arriving in your mind today are already laying brick or striking match, whether or not you have been watching closely enough to notice. The only question this chapter leaves you with is the one that will govern everything that follows. From this page forward, are you finally ready to pick up the tools, and build? Chapter 2, the language you use becomes the life you live. You are, at this moment, narrating your own life to yourself in a private language nobody else can hear, and that narration is not describing your reality. It is building it, one word at a time, whether or not you have ever noticed the construction happening. The problem beneath the problem. Language feels like a neutral reporting tool. You believe you are simply describing what happened. "I bombed that presentation," "I'm terrible with money," "I always freeze up in conflict," as though these sentences were objective transcripts of fact. They are not. They are interpretations wearing the disguise of description, and the words you select do not merely reflect your internal state. They actively construct it, shaping which details you notice next, which emotions intensify, and which future actions feel possible or impossible. Consider a composite case, a man I'll call Obi, who after a single difficult negotiation began describing himself, in his own private narration, as someone who can't hold his ground. He did not consciously decide to adopt this identity. The phrase simply arose after one uncomfortable meeting and, because it went unchallenged, was repeated silently in his mind before the next 3 negotiations, each time priming him to notice moments of hesitation and discount moments of genuine assertiveness. Within a year, colleagues who witnessed only his outward behavior began describing him the same way. The private language had become public reality, not because it was ever accurate, but because it was repeated until it shaped the very behavior it claimed only to describe. This reveals a mechanism psychologists have documented extensively. Language does not merely label internal states, it amplifies and stabilizes them. The specific words you choose after a setback, "I failed," versus "that attempt failed," carry radically different structural consequences, even though they describe the identical external event. The first collapses the event into your identity, permanent and global. The second isolates it as a contained, temporary occurrence. Said once, the difference seems trivial. Said thousands of times, across years, the two phrasings construct entirely different selves. The paradigm shift. The shift required here is precise. Stop treating your internal language as a passive report and start treating it as an active construction tool, subject to the same deliberate editing you would apply to any important document. You would never publish a business proposal riddled with permanent, catastrophic language about your own competence. Yet most people allow their unedited, worst draft internal language to run entirely unexamined, treating its harshest phrasing as simple honesty rather than what it actually is, an unreviewed first draft, granted far more authority than it has earned. This does not mean lying to yourself with hollow positivity. It means applying precision, the same precision a careful editor applies to overstatement, replacing global, permanent, identity-level language with specific, temporary, behavior-level language that remains equally honest but radically less structurally damaging. The systems. System 1, the permanence check. Whenever you catch language describing a setback, check it for words like always, never, or I am attached to a flaw. Replace permanent framing with temporal framing, not I always freeze, but I froze this time. System 2, the identity separation edit. Separate the event from your identity explicitly. Not, I am a failure, but that attempt failed. This single grammatical shift prevents a contained event from being absorbed into your permanent self-concept. System 3, the precision rewrite. For any harsh self-description, demand specificity before accepting it. I'm bad with money is vague and immovable. I overspent on dining out the last 2 months is specific, accurate, and, crucially, actionable. System 4, the narration journal. Nightly, write the exact sentences you used internally to describe your day's setbacks. Reviewing this weekly reveals your default linguistic patterns with a clarity that in-the-moment awareness rarely achieves alone. The closing declaration. There is a version of you who has learned to catch the harsh, unedited first draft of her own inner language before it hardens into identity, who speaks to herself with the same precision and fairness she would extend to someone she respected. That precision, repeated daily, becomes a different self entirely, not one who never struggles, but one whose language never turns a single difficult Tuesday into a permanent verdict. Chapter 3, the filter you never chose. You do not see the world as it is. You see the world as your filter has been trained, over years of unexamined repetition, to let through, and most people go their entire lives never once questioning who installed the filter or what it has been quietly discarding. The problem beneath the problem. The human mind cannot process the full volume of information available in any given moment, so it filters aggressively, admitting only a fraction into conscious awareness. This filtering is necessary and unavoidable. The danger lies in the fact that the filter is not neutral, it is shaped by prior belief, and once shaped, it disproportionately admits information that confirms what you already believe while quietly discarding information that would contradict it. This is not a character flaw. It is a documented cognitive tendency, and it operates on you constantly, beneath conscious detection. Consider a composite professional, a woman I'll call Fala Said, who came to believe, after 2 difficult performance reviews early in her career, that she was not naturally talented at public speaking. From that point forward, her filter began quietly performing selective admission. Every stumble during a presentation registered vividly and was remembered in detail. Every moment of genuine fluency or audience engagement passed through the filter almost unnoticed, discarded as unremarkable or lucky. Over 5 years, this asymmetric filtering constructed an entire body of evidence for a belief that was never actually representative of her real performance, a belief built not from an honest accounting of her presentations, but from a filter that had been trained, early on, to notice only what confirmed the original story. This is the mechanism this chapter must expose directly. The filter does not show you reality. It shows you whatever confirms the belief that built it, and then presents that curated selection to you as if it were objective, comprehensive evidence. This is precisely why simply telling someone, the evidence doesn't support your negative belief, so rarely works. They are not lying when they insist the evidence does support it. Their filter has been diligently curating exactly that evidence for years, discarding the rest before it ever reached conscious awareness. The paradigm shift. The necessary reframe. Stop trusting your spontaneous sense of the evidence as a complete or objective record, and start deliberately auditing what your filter may have been discarding, because a filter trained by an old belief will always find comfortable confirmation for that belief. Comfort is not the same as accuracy. This requires a specific, deliberate discipline, actively searching for disconfirming evidence your filter would otherwise discard by default, not because you are trying to force false positivity, but because genuine accuracy requires examining the full record, not merely the pre-filtered fragment your existing belief has trained you to notice. The systems. System 1, the disconfirmation search. For any strongly held negative self-belief, deliberately search your own history for counterexamples your filter may have discarded. Most people, when forced to search deliberately, discover meaningfully more disconfirming evidence than their spontaneous impression suggested existed. System 2, the filter origin trace. Ask directly, when did I first adopt this belief, and how much evidence actually existed at that founding moment? Many filters were installed by a single early event, disproportionate to the years of confirming evidence later credited to it. System 3, the outside auditor. Periodically ask someone who knows you well to describe the specific pattern your self-belief claims, without prompting them toward your own conclusion. A filter operating only inside your own head cannot be checked from the inside. An outside observer often sees a different, more accurate record entirely. System 4, the complete ledger practice. Weekly, log both confirming and disconfirming instances related to a targeted belief with equal deliberate attention, rather than allowing the filter to record only one column by default. A complete ledger, maintained consistently, slowly retrains what the filter admits. The closing declaration. There is a version of you who no longer mistakes a curated, filtered fragment of her history for the complete truth of who she is, who has learned to interrogate the filter itself rather than accepting its selective report as final verdict. That version sees more of her own evidence, not because more evidence exists, but because she finally went looking for the parts the old filter had been quietly discarding all along. Chapter 4, the story you keep telling. Ask 10 people to describe the same difficult year of their life and you will hear 10 different stories, not because the facts differ, but because each person has already decided, often unconsciously, what kind of story they are living inside, and that decision, more than the facts themselves, determines what the year meant and what it built. The problem beneath the problem. Human beings are not simply collections of facts about their past. We are narrators, constantly organizing scattered events into a coherent story with a plot, a character arc, and an implied trajectory toward some future ending. This narrating function is not optional or occasional, it runs continuously, and it is one of the most underexamined forces shaping identity, because the story feels like memory rather than construction. Consider a composite case, two composite siblings, Adiz and Chinello, who grew up in the same household under the same period of genuine financial hardship. Adiz's internal story, constructed over years, cast the hardship as evidence of a chaotic, unstable world she could never fully trust, a story that later made her risk-averse to the point of missing genuine opportunities. Chinello's internal story, built from the same objective events, cast the hardship as evidence of her family's resourcefulness under pressure, a story that later made her comfortable taking calculated risks, trusting her own capacity to adapt. Identical facts. Radically different stories. And the stories, not the facts, were what shaped each sister's adult decisions. This reveals the mechanism central to this chapter. You are not simply remembering your past. You are continuously authoring it, selecting which events count as turning points, which characters count as villains or mentors, and what the overall arc is bending toward, and this authored story, more than the raw facts it is built from, is what actually governs your present behavior. The paradigm shift. The reframe demanded here: stop treating your life story as a fixed historical record and start treating it as an ongoing editorial project, one you have more authority over than you have been exercising, because the facts of your past are fixed, but the story built from them, the meaning assigned to each event, remains genuinely revisable. This is not a call to rewrite history dishonestly. It is a call to recognize that any set of real events can support multiple honest narrative structures, and the one you have been defaulting to may not be the one best serving the person you are trying to become. The systems. System 1, the plot audit. Write a one-paragraph summary of your life story as you currently tell it to yourself. Examine it for genre. Is it a story of victimhood, of resilience, of chaos, of steady growth? The genre you have unconsciously assigned shapes every decision that follows from it. System 2, the alternate honest version. For one significant difficult chapter of your past, write a second, equally honest version of the story that emphasizes different, also true details, the resourcefulness rather than the chaos, the growth rather than the damage. Both versions can be factually accurate, only one may be serving you. System 3, the turning point reassignment. Identify which events your current story has cast as defining turning points, and ask whether other, less dramatic events might deserve that role instead, moments of quiet competence you may have underweighted in favor of more dramatic failures. System 4, the forward arc declaration. Explicitly write the next chapter of your story before it happens, in the tone and trajectory you intend to author, rather than passively waiting to discover, after the fact, what kind of chapter it turned out to be. The closing declaration. There is a version of you who has taken up the pen on her own story deliberately, who no longer treats her past as an immovable verdict but as raw material available for honest, intentional authorship. She tells a story of resourcefulness where an old draft told one of chaos, not because she is lying to herself, but because she finally recognized she was always the author, and simply hadn't claimed the role. Chapter 5, the war between fear and fact. Fear does not lie to you by inventing threats from nothing. It lies to you by taking one true fragment and inflating it until it eclipses everything else that is also true, and most people never learn to separate the fragment from the eclipse. The problem beneath the problem. Fear-based thinking rarely announces itself as irrational. It arrives wearing the credible costume of realism, of caution, of simply being prepared, and this costume is precisely what makes it so difficult to challenge. When a mind under threat generates a catastrophic prediction, it does not feel like distortion. It feels like foresight. Consider a composite case, a man I'll call Teo, who, after a single client relationship ended badly, developed a fear-driven prediction that resurfaced before every new client meeting: this will end the same way. This prediction was not entirely fictional, it was rooted in one true fact, a real prior failure. But fear had taken that single data point and inflated it into a near-certain forecast, discarding the dozens of client relationships that had gone well, discarding the specific, unusual circumstances of the one failure, and presenting the worst single case as the most probable outcome. Teo began over-preparing defensively, appearing guarded in new client meetings, which occasionally did produce the very outcome he feared, not because his prediction was accurate, but because the fear-driven behavior it produced became partially self-fulfilling. This illustrates the core mechanism of this chapter: fear operates by selective amplification, not invention. It rarely fabricates a threat from nothing, it takes one genuine risk, however small or contextually unusual, and projects it forward as though it were the dominant probability rather than one possibility among many. The antidote, therefore, is not to dismiss fear as pure fiction. That approach collapses the moment fear points to something that did once genuinely happen. The antidote is to separate the true fragment from the exaggerated projection built on top of it. The paradigm shift. The reframe required: stop asking, is this fear based on something real? The answer will almost always be yes, which is precisely why fear feels so convincing. Instead ask, what is the actual, current probability of this outcome, examined with the same rigor I would apply to any other forecast? This shifts the fight from an unwinnable battle against fear's legitimacy toward a winnable audit of fear's math. Fear is frequently right about possibility and wrong about probability. Something is possible. It is rarely as likely as fear insists, once the full evidence, not merely the single vivid fragment fear has selected, is placed on the table. The systems. System 1, the fragment identification. When fear generates a catastrophic prediction, explicitly name the single true fragment it is built from. Isolating the real kernel from the exaggerated projection immediately reduces its totalizing power. System 2, the base rate check. Ask explicitly, out of all the times I have faced a similar situation, how many actually ended in this feared outcome? Fear rarely survives contact with an honest count of prior instances. System 3, the worst-case completion. Rather than avoiding the feared scenario, deliberately walk through it to its actual, specific end, including your realistic capacity to recover from it. Fear thrives on vague, unfinished catastrophe. A fully specified scenario is almost always more survivable than the vague dread suggested. System 4, the fact-fear ledger. Before any high-stakes decision fear is influencing, write 2 separate columns, verified facts and fear-generated predictions. Act on the facts column. Treat the fear column as information about your nervous system, not information about the world. The closing declaration. There is a version of you who has learned to hear fear's warning without surrendering to its arithmetic, who takes the real fragment seriously, discards the inflated projection built on top of it, and moves forward anyway, not from the absence of fear but from an accurate accounting of what it was actually telling her. That version does not wait for fear to fall silent before acting. She has simply learned to stop mistaking its volume for its accuracy. Chapter 6, The Comparison Trap. You are, at every scrolling moment, comparing your unfiltered interior to everyone else's curated exterior, and calling the resulting despair an accurate measurement, when it was never a fair contest to begin with. The problem beneath the problem. Comparison is not inherently destructive, it is one of the oldest tools the human mind uses to calibrate effort and ambition. The danger lies not in comparison itself but in the almost universal asymmetry of the comparison being made. You have complete access to your own doubts, failures, and unglamorous middle chapters, while you have access only to the final, edited, presentable output of everyone else's story. This is not a fair sample. It is a rigged one, and the mind, unaware of the rigging, treats the resulting gap as genuine evidence of inadequacy. Consider a composite case, a woman I'll call Amina, a competent mid-career professional who began experiencing persistent, low-grade inadequacy after regularly viewing the professional updates of former classmates online. She was comparing her actual daily experience, the tedious tasks, the unresolved uncertainties, the ordinary Tuesday, against their highlight reel, a comparison so structurally imbalanced it could not have produced any outcome other than her own perceived deficiency, regardless of her actual standing. The gap she perceived was real to her. It was also almost entirely an artifact of comparing unlike categories of information. This reveals the mechanism at the center of this chapter. Destructive comparison rarely stems from an accurate assessment of relative standing. It stems from comparing your complete, unedited internal experience against someone else's incomplete, edited external presentation, a mismatch in data quality, not a genuine measurement of worth. The paradigm shift. The reframe. Stop treating comparison as a verdict on your value and start treating it as a data quality problem to be corrected before any conclusion is drawn. Before allowing a comparison to influence your self-assessment, explicitly ask whether you are comparing equivalent categories of information, your full interior against their full interior, or your full interior against their curated exterior. Used correctly, comparison can still serve a legitimate function, identifying a genuine skill gap worth closing, or a standard worth aspiring to. The distinction lies in whether the comparison is being used to inform deliberate growth or simply absorbed as a verdict on inherent worth. The systems. System 1, the data quality check. Before accepting any comparison's emotional conclusion, ask explicitly, am I comparing my full interior experience to their full interior experience, or to their curated highlight? Correcting this mismatch alone dissolves a significant portion of comparison-driven despair. System 2, the function reframe. Ask whether a given comparison is being used to identify a specific, actionable skill gap, or simply absorbed as generalized inadequacy. Redirect every comparison toward the former use only. System 3, the comparison diet. Deliberately limit exposure to comparison-triggering environments during periods of vulnerability, not as permanent avoidance, but as a temporary reduction while other systems in this chapter are being installed. System 4, the personal baseline practice. Replace external comparison with comparison against your own prior baseline, this month against last month, this year against last year, restoring a fair, equivalent data comparison that actually reflects your genuine trajectory. The closing declaration. There is a version of you who has stopped measuring her unfiltered interior against everyone else's polished exterior, who has learned to ask what data she is actually comparing before allowing any conclusion to land. She still notices what others have built. She simply no longer mistakes their highlight reel for the full, honest record of a life, including, most importantly, her own. Chapter 7: The Inner Critic's Disguise. Your harshest internal voice does not introduce itself as cruelty. It introduces itself as honesty, as high standards, as the only thing keeping you from becoming lazy or complacent, and this disguise is exactly why so many intelligent people never once question whether their inner critic is actually helping them. The problem beneath the problem. There is a widespread and rarely examined belief that harsh self-criticism is a necessary engine of high achievement, that softening it would mean surrendering to mediocrity. This belief survives because it is partially, superficially true. The inner critic often does coincide with periods of genuine achievement. What goes unexamined is whether the achievement happened because of the harsh criticism or in spite of it, sustained by other, healthier mechanisms operating alongside the criticism rather than because of it. Consider a composite case: a man I'll call Chukwemeka, a high-performing surgeon who believed, sincerely, that his relentless internal criticism, that was sloppy, you should have caught that faster, delivered after nearly every procedure regardless of outcome, was the specific mechanism responsible for his precision. When a structured self-assessment eventually separated his internal experience from his actual behavioral data, a different picture emerged. His improvement curve tracked most closely not with the harshest self-critical periods, which frequently preceded hesitation and second-guessing during procedures, but with periods following specific, non-catastrophizing feedback he gave himself immediately after a genuine error. The harsh global criticism had not been driving his excellence. It had been, at best, neutral, and at worst, quietly undermining the confidence his technical skill required to execute cleanly. This exposes the mechanism this chapter must name directly. The inner critic frequently confuses its own volume with its usefulness, and confuses harshness with rigor, when in fact the two are entirely separable. You can maintain exceptionally high standards without the accompanying cruelty, and the cruelty, once removed, is rarely found to have been doing any of the actual work it claimed credit for. The paradigm shift. The reframe: stop assuming that reducing your inner critic's cruelty means reducing your standards, and start testing the two as separable variables. High standards ask, how can this specific output improve? Cruelty asks, what does this failure prove about my fundamental worth? Only the first question produces useful, actionable information. The second produces only demoralization dressed up as accountability. The systems. System 1, the voice separation test. When your inner critic speaks, explicitly ask whether the statement addresses a specific, correctable behavior or your global worth as a person. Redirect any global worth statement back into a specific, behavioral one before accepting it. System 2, the mentor substitution. Ask explicitly, would a demanding, excellent mentor who genuinely wanted me to improve phrase this feedback this way? Rigorous mentors correct specifically and directly. They rarely deliver global condemnation, because they know it does not improve performance. System 3, the evidence request. Demand that your inner critic provide specific, falsifiable evidence for any global claim it makes. You always mess this up rarely survives a genuine request for a complete, honest count of instances. System 4, the standard cruelty decoupling log. Track instances where you maintained rigorous standards while explicitly declining cruel self-talk, and note the actual outcome. Over time, this log provides direct personal evidence that the two were never as fused as the inner critic insisted. The closing declaration. There is a version of you who has learned to keep the standards and release the cruelty, who corrects her mistakes with precision rather than condemnation, and who has discovered, through direct evidence rather than mere hope, that her actual performance improved once the inner critic's disguise was finally seen through. She did not become soft. She became accurate. Chapter 8, The Power of Reframing. The hook. The event never changes. The frame around it does, and it is the frame, not the event, that determines whether a given moment becomes the reason you stopped or the reason you finally understood how to continue. The problem beneath the problem. Most people believe their emotional reaction to an event is a direct, automatic, and singular response to that event. This belief overlooks a crucial intermediate step. Between any event and your emotional response to it sits an interpretation, a frame, and that frame is doing far more work than the raw event itself. The same external circumstance, framed differently, produces measurably different physiological and behavioral outcomes, a fact demonstrated repeatedly in behavioral research on stress appraisal, where a fixed frame such as, "this challenge is a threat," versus, "this challenge is an opportunity to demonstrate capability," changes not just subjective experience but even measurable stress response patterns. Consider a composite case: two composite colleagues, F and Osaze, informed on the same day of an identical, significant restructuring at their company that placed both their roles at risk. F's spontaneous frame was, "this is happening to me, and I have no control," a frame that produced paralysis, poor sleep, and a defensive, closed posture in subsequent internal meetings that, ultimately, made him appear less adaptable to decision-makers. Osaze's frame, deliberately chosen rather than spontaneous, was, "this is a forcing function to finally pursue the internal transfer I've been considering," identical circumstance, radically different frame, and a radically different trajectory of behavior that followed from it. Neither frame altered the objective restructuring. Both altered everything that happened next. This illustrates the mechanism at the core of this chapter: you cannot always choose the event. You can, with deliberate practice, choose the frame you apply to it, and the frame, not the raw event, is what your nervous system and your subsequent behavior actually respond to. The paradigm shift. The reframe: stop treating your first, spontaneous interpretation of an event as the only available or most accurate one, and start treating frame selection as an active, repeatable skill, not denial of difficulty, but deliberate selection among multiple honest ways of holding the same true facts. This is not about manufacturing false positivity. A dishonest frame collapses under scrutiny and produces further disappointment when reality fails to match it. An honest, deliberately selected frame remains fully truthful to the facts while choosing, among several equally accurate interpretations, the one most likely to produce constructive rather than paralyzing behavior. The systems. System 1, the multiple frame generation. For any significant difficult event, deliberately generate at least 3 distinct, equally honest frames before settling on one. Most people never generate alternatives, they simply accept whichever frame arrived first, uncontested. System 2, the threat-to-challenge conversion. Practice explicitly converting threat-framed language into challenge-framed language, not, "this could ruin everything," but, "this is demanding that I rise to something specific." Both are honest, only one produces useful physiological and behavioral readiness. System 3, the constructive behavior filter. Test candidate frames by asking which one produces the most constructive next action. A frame that leaves you paralyzed, however emotionally satisfying its righteousness, fails this test regardless of its surface appeal. System 4, the frame journal. Track, over months, which frames you selected for major events and what followed from each. This builds a personal, evidence-based case for your own frame selection skill, rather than relying on abstract belief in the concept. The closing declaration. There is a version of you who has stopped mistaking her first spontaneous interpretation for the only true one, who pauses, deliberately, at the exact moment an old frame would have taken over automatically, and chooses instead the honest frame most likely to build rather than paralyze. The event will still arrive, exactly as difficult as it always was. What changes is everything that happens in the moments immediately after it. Chapter 9, the silence between thoughts. The hook. You have spent your entire life identifying so completely with your thoughts that you have never once noticed the quiet, steady witness observing them, and that witness, once discovered, changes the entire game, because it reveals that you were never actually your thoughts to begin with. The problem beneath the problem. Most people live in a state of complete fusion with their thinking, so merged with each passing thought that, I am anxious, and I am noticing anxiety arise, feel identical, when they are, in fact, describing two entirely different relationships to the same experience. This fusion is so total, and so constant, that most people have never experienced even a brief moment of separation between themselves and their thinking, and therefore assume no such separation is possible. Consider a composite case, a woman I'll call Bimp, who suffered for years from what she described as constant anxiety, a description that, on examination, actually meant something more precise. She experienced anxious thoughts and immediately, automatically, became fully identified with them, unable to locate any gap between the thought's arrival and her total absorption into it. Through sustained practice in simply noticing thoughts as objects arising and passing, rather than as truths she was obligated to fully inhabit, Bimp discovered something that felt, initially, almost unbelievable: a gap existed. It had always existed. She had simply never been trained to notice it, because nobody had ever pointed toward the noticing itself rather than toward the content of what was being noticed. This reveals the mechanism central to this chapter. Beneath the constant stream of thoughts, there exists a quieter, more stable capacity that simply observes the stream, and this observing capacity, once located, is not identical to any single thought, which means it is not swept away by any single thought either. This is not a mystical claim. It is a describable, trainable shift in attention, and it forms the foundation for every other system in this book, because none of the prior chapters' techniques, auditing, reframing, interrupting, are possible without first establishing enough separation from a thought to examine it at all. The paradigm shift. The reframe: you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness in which thoughts arise, persist briefly, and pass, and cultivating access to that awareness, even briefly, gives you a stable position from which every other tool in this book can actually be applied, rather than attempted from inside the very fusion these tools are meant to interrupt. This distinction is not academic. A person fully fused with an anxious thought cannot apply a reframe to it, because there is no gap in which the reframe can operate. A person who has found even a small amount of separation, enough to notice a thought just arose, rather than simply being consumed by it, has already created the space every other chapter in this book depends on. The systems. System 1, the naming practice. When a strong thought arises, silently name it as an object rather than a fact. There is a thought that I am going to fail, rather than simply, I am going to fail. This small linguistic shift creates immediate, measurable separation between you and the thought's content. System 2, the daily silence interval. Set aside a brief daily interval, even 5 minutes, with no input, no task, simply observing whatever arises without engaging it. This is not about achieving a blank mind, it is about practicing the specific skill of noticing thought as it passes, rather than automatically boarding it. System 3, the body anchor. When fusion with a difficult thought feels total, redirect attention briefly to a specific physical sensation, the weight of your feet, the temperature of the air. This anchors awareness in something other than the thought stream, re-establishing the gap that fusion had closed. System 4, the witness question. Periodically throughout the day, ask simply, who is aware of this thought right now? This question has no complicated answer to memorize, its value lies entirely in the brief redirection of attention it produces, toward the witnessing rather than the witnessed. The closing declaration. There is a version of you who has discovered, through direct and repeated practice, that she was never actually her thoughts, that beneath the noise, a quieter and more stable awareness has been present the entire time, unshaken by any single thought's arrival, however loud. From that steadier ground, every tool in this book becomes possible to apply, not as effortful resistance against an overwhelming stream, but as a calm, deliberate choice made from a position the old, fully fused version of you never knew existed. Chapter 10, the belief you inherited. Some of the walls you have spent years trying to break through were never built by you at all, they were handed to you, fully constructed, before you were old enough to question the architect, and you have been living inside someone else's blueprint ever since, mistaking it for your own foundation. The problem beneath the problem. A significant portion of the beliefs governing an adult's thinking were not consciously chosen. They were absorbed, from family narratives repeated at dinner tables, from cultural assumptions never spoken aloud but constantly enforced, from a single offhand comment made by an authority figure during a formative year, delivered with enough weight to calcify into a permanent rule. These inherited beliefs are particularly resistant to change precisely because they were never adopted through reasoning, and therefore cannot always be dismantled through reasoning alone. They must first be identified as inherited at all, a step most people never take because the belief feels less like a belief and more like simple, unquestionable fact. Consider a composite case, a man I'll call Ikenna, who held a persistent belief that people in our family don't ask for help, we handle things ourselves, a rule never explicitly taught but modeled consistently across 2 generations he observed growing up. This belief operated for decades as though it were simply a fact about reality rather than one particular family's coping strategy, formed under specific historical circumstances that no longer applied to Ikenna's own life. It cost him, over the years, mentorship he could have accessed, support he could have accepted, and collaborative opportunities he quietly sabotaged rather than admit he needed anyone's assistance. The belief was never examined, because it never announced itself as a belief. It arrived disguised as simply, how our family is. This reveals the mechanism this chapter must name. Inherited beliefs are especially powerful precisely because they bypass the scrutiny a consciously adopted belief would receive. They are absorbed during years when critical evaluation was not yet developed, and they persist into adulthood wearing the camouflage of self-evident fact rather than the more accurate label of one inherited interpretation among many possible ones. The paradigm shift. The reframe. Stop treating long-held beliefs as self-evidently true simply because you cannot remember choosing them, and start actively tracing their origin, because a belief that was inherited rather than examined has never actually earned the authority it currently holds over your decisions. This tracing is not about blaming the people who transmitted the belief, most of whom were themselves operating from inherited frameworks they never examined either. It is about reclaiming authorship, recognizing that a belief formed under someone else's specific historical circumstances may no longer serve, or may never have accurately served, your own. The systems. System 1, the origin trace. For any belief that feels absolute and unquestionable, ask directly, where did I first learn this, and from whom? A belief that traces back to a specific person or repeated family pattern, rather than your own direct, examined experience, deserves fresh scrutiny. System 2, the contextual relevance check. Ask whether the circumstances that originally produced the belief still apply to your current life. A rule formed to survive genuine scarcity decades ago may actively sabotage decisions made under entirely different present circumstances. System 3, the conscious reclamation. For each traced inherited belief, decide deliberately whether to keep it, modify it, or discard it, converting an unexamined inheritance into a consciously chosen position, even if the final content remains unchanged. The examination itself transfers authorship back to you. System 4, the new model search. Actively seek out examples of people who hold a different, more useful belief in the same domain, and study specifically how their differing belief shapes differing outcomes. This provides concrete proof that the inherited belief was never the only available option. The closing declaration. There is a version of you who has walked back through her own inherited architecture, room by room, keeping what still serves and dismantling what was built for circumstances that no longer exist. She no longer mistakes the blueprint she was handed for the only possible foundation. She has become, finally, the architect of her own house. Chapter 11, The Mind Under Pressure. You do not discover what you actually believe by examining yourself on a calm afternoon. You discover it in the 90 seconds after everything goes wrong, because pressure does not create your thinking patterns, it simply strips away the composure that was hiding them. The problem beneath the problem. Most people assume their thinking under pressure is a temporary aberration, disconnected from their real, calmer thought patterns. This assumption is comforting and largely incorrect. Pressure does not generate new thinking from nothing, it accelerates and intensifies whatever thinking patterns already existed beneath the surface, while simultaneously removing the deliberate, effortful oversight that normally moderates them. What appears under pressure is not a distortion of your real thinking, it is frequently the most honest, unfiltered version of it. Consider a composite case: a woman I'll call Ronk, a capable operations manager who prided herself on calm, rational decision-making, until a genuine supply chain crisis revealed a pattern she had never previously observed in herself: catastrophizing language, blame assignment, and a rigid inability to consider more than one course of action. She initially explained this away as just stress talking, a temporary aberration unconnected to her real thinking. Closer examination revealed something less comfortable. The catastrophizing pattern had been present in milder form during ordinary daily setbacks all along, simply moderated by enough available bandwidth to catch and soften it before it became visible to others. The crisis had not created the pattern. It had removed her capacity to hide it. This reveals the mechanism at the center of this chapter. Pressure functions less like a distortion field and more like an X-ray, revealing thinking patterns that were always present but ordinarily concealed beneath sufficient bandwidth to self-correct in real time. Preparing for pressure, therefore, is not a separate project from the daily thought work described throughout this book. It is a direct continuation of it, tested under conditions that remove the usual margin for quiet correction. The paradigm shift. The reframe: stop treating your under-pressure thinking as a separate, excusable exception to your real character, and start treating it as valuable, honest information about which patterns from this book's earlier chapters remain incompletely installed. A pattern that only holds under calm conditions has not yet been fully trained, it has simply not yet been tested. This is not a demand for superhuman composure during genuine crisis. It is a recognition that the specific thought patterns pressure reveals are the most important ones to deliberately rehearse in advance, precisely because pressure removes the luxury of figuring them out in the moment. The systems. System 1, the post-crisis pattern review. After any high-pressure event, once calm returns, review your actual thoughts during the peak of the pressure without excusing them as just stress. Treat them as accurate data about patterns needing further deliberate work. System 2, the pre-rehearsed response. For predictable high-pressure scenarios within your work or life, script and rehearse a specific first response in advance, so that pressure activates a prepared pattern rather than an unexamined default one. System 3, the breath before reaction pause. Install a fixed, minimal physical pause, even 3 deliberate breaths, between a pressure trigger and your first response. This brief interval is frequently sufficient to interrupt an automatic catastrophizing pattern before it fully activates. System 4, the bandwidth buffer. Deliberately reduce non-essential decision load during periods of anticipated high pressure, preserving mental bandwidth specifically for maintaining the thinking patterns this book has been building, rather than allowing them to be the first casualty of an overloaded system. The closing declaration. There is a version of you who no longer excuses her under-pressure thinking as a stranger wearing her face, who has done the deliberate rehearsal in calm conditions precisely so that pressure, when it inevitably arrives, reveals a mind that has already done its work. The crisis will still be difficult. What changes is what the X-ray finds underneath. Chapter 12, the discipline of positive realism. Blind optimism and honest hope are not the same instrument, though they are frequently mistaken for one another. One shatters at the first contact with hard evidence, and the other, built correctly, is precisely what allows a person to face hard evidence without shattering at all. The problem beneath the problem. There is a well-intentioned but ultimately fragile strain of positive thinking that insists on relentless optimism regardless of evidence, a belief that negative possibilities must not be entertained at all, lest entertaining them somehow summon them into reality. This approach feels virtuous and protective. It is also brittle, because it has no mechanism for handling the moment reality delivers a genuinely difficult outcome that the relentless optimism had refused to prepare for. When that moment arrives, the entire structure collapses at once, often taking the person's broader capacity for hope down with it. Consider a composite case: a woman I'll call Adayabi, who ran a small business under a strict personal policy of only positive thoughts allowed, refusing to seriously entertain the possibility of a significant slow season, treating the very consideration as a kind of self-sabotage. When a genuinely difficult slow season arrived regardless, entirely unprepared for financially or psychologically, the resulting crisis was considerably more severe than it would have been had realistic contingency planning been permitted alongside the optimism. Her positivity had not protected her from a bad outcome. It had removed her ability to prepare for one. Contrast this with a composite case, a man I'll call Femi, who held what researchers sometimes describe as a defensively realistic form of hope, genuine belief in a positive outcome, held alongside honest, unflinching acknowledgement of specific risks, each paired with a concrete contingency plan. When Femi's business faced a comparably difficult period, his underlying hope remained intact, not because he had avoided considering the difficulty, but because he had already prepared for it without ever abandoning his belief in an eventual positive trajectory. This is the distinction this chapter must install. Genuine, durable hope is not the absence of acknowledged risk. It is the presence of belief in a positive outcome held simultaneously with honest preparation for a difficult one, and it is this combination, not blind positivity, that survives actual contact with hard reality. The paradigm shift. The reframe: stop treating the acknowledgement of risk as a betrayal of optimism, and start treating realistic risk assessment as the load-bearing foundation that allows genuine hope to remain standing when reality gets difficult. Positive realism asks you to hold two things at once: authentic belief in a good outcome, and honest preparation for a hard one, refusing the false choice between naive positivity and defeated pessimism. The systems. System 1, the dual-column practice. For any significant goal, maintain two honest columns: the specific positive outcome you believe possible, and the specific realistic risks that could interfere with it, each risk paired with a concrete contingency. Neither column cancels the other. System 2, the risk without rumination boundary. Acknowledge a risk once, plan for it concretely, and then deliberately redirect attention back toward constructive action, rather than allowing acknowledged risk to become a spiraling rumination. The goal is preparation, not preoccupation. System 3, the evidence-based hope statement. Replace vague affirmations with specific, evidence-grounded hope statements, not "everything will be fine," but "I have handled comparable difficulty before, and I have a concrete plan if this outcome occurs." Specificity is what makes the hope durable under pressure. System 4, the post-difficulty hope audit. After facing a genuine setback, examine whether your hope survived intact. If it collapsed entirely, trace whether the original optimism had been paired with realistic contingency planning, or whether it had been the brittle, unprepared variety this chapter warns against. The closing declaration. There is a version of you whose hope has been tested against real difficulty and found still standing, not because she refused to look at the risk, but because she looked directly at it, prepared for it honestly, and continued believing in the outcome she was building toward anyway. That hope does not need protecting from reality. It was built, from the beginning, to withstand it. Chapter 13, the thoughts that build relationships. You do not respond to what another person actually said. You respond to the story you instantly, silently told yourself about what they meant by it, and most conflict in most relationships is a war between two private, unverified stories, mistaken by both sides for objective fact. The problem beneath the problem. The mind cannot tolerate ambiguity for long. The instant another person's words, tone, or silence leaves room for interpretation, the mind rushes to fill that gap with a story, usually within a fraction of a second, and usually without any conscious awareness that a story has been constructed at all. This story, not the other person's actual intent, is what triggers the emotional and behavioral response that follows, which means a significant portion of relational conflict is not actually a disagreement about reality, but a collision between two independently constructed, unverified interpretations of an ambiguous moment. Consider a composite case, a couple I'll call Namdi and Ifeoma, who experienced a recurring conflict pattern triggered by a specific, small behavior, Namdi's tendency to go quiet after a long workday. Ifeoma's instant, unexamined story filled that silence with, "He's upset with me and withdrawing as punishment," a story that triggered hurt and defensive questioning. Namdi's actual internal experience, when finally examined directly rather than assumed, was simple depletion requiring quiet recovery time, entirely unrelated to iphioma. Years of recurring tension had been fueled not by any actual conflict between them, but by one partner's unverified story about an ambiguous behavior, treated as though it were confirmed fact. This reveals the mechanism this chapter addresses directly. The mind fills relational ambiguity with a story instantly and unconsciously, and that story, rather than the other person's actual internal state, becomes the operative reality you respond to, unless you deliberately pause to check the story against the other person's own account before acting on it. The paradigm shift. The reframe. Stop treating your instant interpretation of another person's ambiguous behavior as verified fact, and start treating it explicitly as an unconfirmed hypothesis requiring a check before it governs your response. This single habit, pausing between an ambiguous moment and the story constructed from it, prevents an enormous proportion of relational damage that would otherwise be caused not by any real conflict, but by two people independently reacting to their own unverified narrations of each other. The systems. System 1, the hypothesis framing. When an ambiguous relational moment triggers a strong internal story, explicitly label it internally as a hypothesis rather than a fact. My hypothesis is that this silence means X, rather than simply assuming X is true. System 2, the direct check. Before acting on a relational hypothesis, ask the other person directly, in specific, non-accusatory language, rather than responding to your own unverified interpretation as though it had already been confirmed. System 3, the alternative explanation generation. Before accepting your first interpretation of an ambiguous behavior, generate at least one alternative, equally plausible explanation unrelated to yourself. This single habit interrupts the mind's default tendency towards self-referential, worst-case interpretation. System 4, the story disclosure practice. In close relationships, practice explicitly sharing your interpretive story rather than only your resulting emotion. I noticed you went quiet, and the story I told myself was that you were upset with me. Is that accurate? This converts a private, unverified assumption into a shared, checkable conversation. The closing declaration. There is a version of you who has learned to catch the instant story her mind constructs around another person's ambiguous behavior, and to hold it loosely, as a hypothesis rather than a verdict, until it has actually been checked. Her relationships are not free of misunderstanding. They are simply no longer built, silently, on two people's unexamined and unverified private narrations of each other. Chapter 14, the vision that pulls you forward. A mind without a specific future to build toward will default to replaying the past, because the mind requires direction the way a plant requires light, and if you do not deliberately give it one, it will bend, reliably, toward whatever is already familiar, however unsatisfying that familiar direction has become. The problem beneath the problem. Most people hold their future in vague, wishful terms. I want to be successful, I want to be happier, language too imprecise to actually direct behavior. A vague future exerts almost no pull on present decision-making, because the mind cannot orient itself toward a destination it cannot clearly picture. In the absence of a specific, vivid pull from ahead, the mind defaults to being pushed by whatever is behind it, old patterns, old fears, old stories examined throughout this book, all of which are considerably more vivid and specific than the vague, unformed future competing against them. Consider a composite case, a woman I'll call Zainab, who spent years describing her ambition only in the vague terms of wanting more from her career, a phrase specific enough to generate mild dissatisfaction but far too vague to generate directed action. When she was guided to construct a genuinely specific vision, not a vague feeling but a detailed, concrete picture of a particular role, a particular kind of daily work, a particular level of impact, rendered vividly enough that she could describe a typical Tuesday inside it, her decision-making shifted almost immediately. Opportunities that had seemed equally plausible before now sorted clearly into moves me toward this specific picture, and does not, a discrimination her vague former ambition had been structurally incapable of making. This reveals the mechanism central to this chapter. A vague future provides no navigational pull, leaving the present moment to be governed by default, backward-facing patterns. A specific, vividly constructed future exerts genuine directive force, because the mind can orient present decisions toward a destination it can actually picture in detail. The paradigm shift. The reframe: stop treating your future ambitions as adequately expressed through vague, emotional language, and start treating vision construction as a precise, deliberate exercise, because specificity, not intensity of feeling, is what determines whether a vision can actually pull present behavior toward it. This is not about rigidly forecasting every detail of an unpredictable future. It is about constructing enough concrete specificity that the vision becomes a usable navigational tool rather than a pleasant but functionally inert wish. The systems. System 1, the Tuesday test. Construct your vision in enough detail that you can describe an ordinary Tuesday inside it, not the dramatic achievement moment, but the mundane daily texture of the life or work you are building toward. Vague ambitions fail this test, genuine visions pass it easily. System 2, the decision filter application. Before any significant decision, explicitly ask whether each option moves you toward or away from the specific vision you have constructed. A vague ambition cannot perform this filtering function, a specific vision performs it immediately and clearly. System 3, the vivid rehearsal practice. Regularly, briefly rehearse the specific vision in vivid sensory detail, not as escapism but as active reinforcement of the directional pull it is meant to exert on present behavior. System 4, the course correction review. Periodically compare your recent decisions against your stated vision, and honestly note any drift. A vision loses its pulling power the moment it stops being consulted, and this review restores its active influence over present choices. The closing declaration. There is a version of you being pulled forward by a future she can see with genuine clarity, rather than pushed from behind by patterns she has spent this entire book learning to examine and release. That pull does not require dramatic motivation or constant intensity. It requires only specificity, rehearsed consistently, until the picture ahead becomes more vivid, and more directive, than anything trailing behind her. Chapter 15, The Mind You Leave Behind. You will not be remembered, in the end, for any single triumphant thought, you will be remembered for the accumulated pattern of how you thought, day after unwitnessed day, and that pattern will have shaped not only your own life but every life your thinking ever touched. The problem beneath the problem. It is tempting, having reached the final chapter of a book like this one, to treat everything that came before as a private project, internal work, undertaken for personal peace, with consequences that stop at the edges of your own experience. This framing, while understandable, dramatically understates what is actually at stake. Thought patterns are not sealed inside the mind that generates them. They leak, constantly, into tone of voice, into patience or its absence, into the specific language used to encourage or discourage a child, a colleague, a friend facing their own difficulty. The mind you have been quietly constructing across every prior chapter does not stay contained. It becomes the atmosphere other people live inside when they are near you. Consider a composite case, a woman I'll call Grandma Nkiru, a figure recalled across an entire extended family not primarily for any single achievement, but for a specific, consistent quality of mind she brought to every difficulty she witnessed in others, an unhurried, non-catastrophizing steadiness that, across decades, became the emotional reference point an entire family unconsciously calibrated against during their own crises. She had done, by all accounts, exactly the kind of internal work this book has described, catching harsh internal language before it hardened, questioning inherited beliefs rather than blindly transmitting them, choosing frames deliberately rather than defaulting to catastrophe. None of this work was visible directly. What was visible, to everyone around her for decades, was its accumulated output, a mind that had become, itself, a stabilizing environment for everyone who spent time inside its influence. This reveals the final mechanism this book must leave you with. The thought work described across every chapter of this book was never merely a private project. It is, whether you have framed it this way or not, the construction of an environment, the atmosphere your children, colleagues, friends, and community will breathe when they are near your mind, long after any single conversation has been forgotten. The paradigm shift. The final reframe: stop treating your internal thought work as separate from your legacy, and start recognizing it as the primary material your legacy will actually be built from, because people rarely remember the specific advice you gave them, but they remember, with striking permanence, the quality of mind they experienced in your presence during their own difficulty. This raises the stakes of everything covered in this book beyond personal peace alone, into something closer to a quiet act of stewardship, not because you owe anyone a performance of constant calm, but because the mind you have been deliberately constructing, chapter by chapter, will inevitably become part of the inheritance you leave behind, whether you have claimed that responsibility consciously or not. The systems. System 1, the atmosphere audit. Periodically ask the people closest to you, directly, what it feels like to be around your mind during difficulty, not your advice, but your presence. Their honest answer reveals your actual atmospheric output more accurately than your private self-assessment. System 2, the transmission awareness. Notice specifically which of your own thought patterns, both the constructive ones built through this book's work, and the older, unexamined ones, you observe beginning to appear in those closest to you, particularly children or ments who absorb pattern more than instruction. System 3, the legacy language practice. In moments of guiding someone else through their own difficulty, deliberately apply the specific systems from this book, the precision language of Chapter 2, the frame selection of Chapter 8, externally, on their behalf, converting your internal work into a transmissible gift rather than a private possession. System 4, the long view commitment. Periodically revisit the question this final chapter poses directly: what quality of mind do you want to be remembered for having brought into rooms, and are your current daily thought patterns, examined honestly, actually constructing that legacy, or something else entirely? The closing declaration. You began this book believing, perhaps, that your thoughts were private, whether inconsequential beyond your own skull. You now understand what was true from the very first page: every thought repeated was laying a brick or striking a match, not only inside your own life, but inside every life your mind would ever touch. The mind you are building, chapter by deliberate chapter, will not stay contained. It will become the atmosphere someone else breathes during their hardest season: a child, a colleague, a friend, perhaps someone not yet born. Build it, then, not only for the peace it will bring you, but for what it will quietly become in everyone who ever stands close enough to feel its weather. That work was never small. It was, from the beginning, the entire architecture of everything you will ever leave behind. Recommendations. How to use this book going forward. This book was built to be lived with, not simply finished. The following recommendations are offered as a practical bridge between reading these 15 chapters and actually rebuilding your own thinking over the months ahead. Reread one chapter per week, not the whole book in a single sitting. Each chapter contains enough depth for 7 days of applied noticing and practice. Moving through all 15 chapters too quickly will leave you with information rather than transformation. Choose one system per chapter, not all 4 at once. Every chapter offered 4 standalone systems. Attempting all 60 simultaneously guarantees overwhelm. Select the single system addressing your most pressing current pattern, apply it fully for at least 2 weeks, and only then add another. Start with the architecture audit and the silence between thoughts. Of all 15 chapters, Chapter 1's audit and Chapter 9's awareness practice form the foundation every other chapter depends on. Without the ability to notice a thought and create a small gap around it, the remaining systems have nothing to work with. Keep the narration journal and the fact-fear ledger as permanent practices. These 2 tools, introduced in Chapters 2 and 5, are recommended as ongoing habits rather than temporary interventions, since they continually surface the raw material every other chapter's systems are designed to work with. Return to Chapter 15 whenever the private nature of this work starts to feel unmotivating. The mind you leave behind exists specifically for moments when internal work feels disconnected from anything beyond yourself. It is not a farewell chapter. It is a chapter to revisit whenever you need reminding of what this work actually builds, and who eventually stands to inherit it. This book has handed you the blueprint. The construction itself will happen the way every genuine rebuilding does, one noticed, examined, and deliberately chosen thought at a time. Conclusion. You arrived at this book carrying a mind you had likely never fully examined, one that had been quietly building or quietly burning your life for years, largely without your conscious participation in the process. What you now hold, across these 15 chapters, is not a single insight but a complete architecture, language precise enough to stop turning setbacks into permanent verdicts, a filter you have learned to audit rather than blindly trust, a story you have reclaimed authorship over, a fear you can now separate from fact, a comparison instinct you can correct for data quality, an inner critic you have learned to decouple from your actual standards, a frame selection skill sturdy enough to hold under real difficulty, a witnessing awareness beneath the noise, an inherited belief system you have finally traced to its origins, a mind tested honestly under pressure, a hope built to survive contact with reality, relational stories you now check before acting on, a vision specific enough to pull you forward, and a clear understanding of what all of this was actually building toward. None of these 15 chapters was designed to produce a single dramatic transformation read in isolation. That was never the model, and by now you understand precisely why. A mind is not changed by one powerful insight any more than an empire is built by one powerful day. It is changed the same way everything durable is ever built, through repetition, deliberately aimed, chapter compounding into chapter, system compounding into system, until the old, unexamined patterns are quietly outnumbered by new ones you chose on purpose. The thoughts arriving in your mind tomorrow morning will already be laying brick or striking match, exactly as they have every morning before this one. The only difference, now, is that you will be watching. Close this book, and begin the least dramatic, most powerful decision available to you, noticing the next thought, naming what it is building, and choosing, deliberately, to keep laying brick. That is the entire method. That is how a mind is finally, quietly, rebuilt.